They say that legends are born in fire, in blood, and in the whispered stories of those too afraid to speak their truths aloud. Some legends grow like vines, twisting themselves into every crevice of human memory, choking out fact and replacing it with something far more intoxicating: terror. And there are some tales so grotesque, so saturated in dread, that they feel less like stories and more like shadows stitched into the fabric of time itself. This is one of those shadows, a figure whispered about in medieval Europe, half man and half myth, cloaked not in anonymity, but in a horror more intimate than any black hood. He was said to wear a mask, not of iron, not of leather, but of human skin, flayed from the condemned whose lives he ended. Was he real, or was he an invention of fear? And if he was real, what force drove a man to carry the weight of death in such a grotesque display? Perhaps the answer lies not only in him, but in us, in the hunger for spectacle, in the shadows we try to exile but cannot escape. Imagine a marketplace at dawn, the ground still wet from midnight rains, the smell of iron from the blacksmith's stall mixing with the sweetness of bread pulled from clay ovens. And above it all, a strange silence, broken only by the murmur of villagers gathering not for trade, not for celebration, but to witness. The wooden scaffold looms in the square like a stage raised for a cruel play. It is here that death itself becomes spectacle, and the executioner becomes its high priest. Mothers clutch their children's hands so tightly the knuckles blanch. Fathers whisper prayers under their breath, and all eyes lift to the figure who wields the blade of the state. Normally, the executioner's anonymity was protected by a hood, a way to shield the man from the wrath of families whose blood he spilled. But this legend, was different. His anonymity was not preserved by fabric, but obliterated by horror. The mask he wore bore the features of those who had already fallen beneath his axe. Executioners in medieval Europe occupied a place unlike any other. They were both necessary and despised. They administered justice for kings, for bishops, for cities desperate to maintain order, yet they were treated as outcasts, tainted by the very act of killing. They often lived at the edges of towns, their homes marked by silence, their families condemned to inherit the profession. They were forbidden from dining with others, sometimes forbidden from entering churches, yet they were summoned to carry out the most sacred of duties, the cleansing of society by blood. A paradox of existence, necessary but untouchable, paid well, sometimes in coin, sometimes in goods, but cursed to live outside the very community they served. This contradiction made the executioner both feared and pitied, a man who bore the sins of others while being branded with them himself. And yet, in this world of paradox and cruelty, a legend emerged of an executioner who carried his role further than anyone dared. He was said to wear not the black hood of anonymity, not the iron mask of ritual, but something infinitely more horrifying, masks stitched from the faces of his victims. A mask that breathed the final breath of those it once belonged to. A mask that seemed less like clothing and more like an invocation, summoning fear that lingered long after the axe fell. Was this merely folklore, an exaggeration told by peasants who wanted their children to sleep in trembling silence? Or was it a distorted truth, an echo of a man who had indeed crossed the threshold of duty into something far darker? Legends endure for a reason. They are vessels for truths we cannot admit openly. Consider the human face. Science tells us it is the most potent image our brains will ever know. Infants hours old can track a face, their tiny neurons lighting up at the recognition of eyes, nose, mouth. Across cultures, faces are our language, our signatures, our maps of identity. To see a face is to see meaning. And what greater horror, then, than to see a face stripped of life, emptied of expression, reduced to leathered skin and hollow sockets? To see such a face not buried with dignity, but displayed, paraded, worn? To look into eyes that no longer look back? It is a terror that bypasses reason and strikes directly into the primal core of our minds. The executioner's mask, whether real or imagined, weaponized this primal recognition. He turned humanity's deepest comfort, the recognition of a face, into its most unbearable nightmare. The legend insists he did not create these masks once or twice, but again and again, until his very appearance became inseparable from them. Some accounts say he would stand at the scaffold as torches flickered, the stitched lips of the mask glistening like wounds. Others say that beneath the mask, no one knew his true features, for he had become faceless himself, absorbed into the many fragments of those he executed. Each victim lived on, grotesquely, in his legend. But perhaps the greatest terror was not in the mask itself, but in what it implied, that justice and cruelty are not opposites, but partners. That the very system designed to preserve order had, in him, birthed a monster. Philosophers of the time wrestled with questions of the soul. Was it housed in the heart, in the blood, in the eyes? For many, the face was the soul's vessel, its mirror. Eyes were the windows not just to thought, but to eternity. To steal a face, then, was not merely to mutilate the body. It was to claim ownership of a soul's final reflection. If he truly wore such masks, he was not only executioner but priest, not only killer but sorcerer, conducting rituals that blur the line between law and desecration. In him, the sacred and the profane collapsed into one figure. And perhaps that is why he terrified so completely. Because he did not just kill bodies, he consumed identities. The villagers whispered. Children were warned to behave, lest the masked executioner come for them in the night. Some claimed they heard his footsteps echo long after midnight, as though he lingered in streets emptied of life. Others swore they had seen him beyond the scaffold, walking fields, crossing rivers, his mask gleaming in moonlight. Was he a man, cursed to wander forever with the faces of the dead? Or had he become something more than mortal, a legend so potent it could not die with him? The stories spread, bending with each retelling, but always carrying the same undercurrent. He was not just executioner. He was something else, something born of fear and made immortal by it. And yet, amid the terror, there were whispers of admiration. He did what others could not. He bore the weight of society's cruelty so others could remain clean. Kings ordered executions, priests blessed them, villagers demanded them, but it was he who swung the blade. He who stained his hands so theirs could remain pure. Was he not, in some twisted way, the scapegoat of justice? The dark servant of order, reviled in public, but indispensable in silence? And if so, might not the mask have been his crown, his grotesque emblem of sovereignty in a kingdom of death? For every society needs its guardians, its gatekeepers, its monsters. And sometimes those monsters are made, not born. This is the paradox of legends. Even if disproven, they endure. For the question is not whether the mask of human faces existed in reality. The question is why the story was told, why it spread, why it survived. Humanity creates monsters when it needs them. We birth horrors to give shape to the fears we cannot name. And the masked executioner became precisely that, a vessel for fear, a mirror for cruelty, a symbol of the shadows we would rather not see in ourselves. And so the tale survives not because it is true, but because it is necessary. As the crowd gathers, the scaffold creaks. The condemned trembles, not from a blade poised above them, but from the sight of the executioner's mask. To die is one thing. To die while staring into the lifeless features of another human, knowing that one's own face may soon join that collection, is something else entirely. The scream that rises is not only of pain, but of recognition, that every face in time becomes a mask worn by memory, by legend, by the voices that carry us when we are gone. And in that scream lies the essence of humanity's oldest fear, not of death itself, but of being forgotten, of having our faces taken away and given to another. And so we begin, a story of flesh and fear, of power and paradox, of humanity at its most grotesque and most revealing. Tonight, You will walk into the darkness of medieval justice, into the shadow of the man who wore the faces of the dead. And when we emerge, you may not look at your own reflection the same way again. It is one thing to fear the mask, and another to wonder about the man who wore it. If legends are born of whispers, then men are born of earth, hunger, and circumstance. To understand how a figure so dreadful could ever rise, we must begin not with his scaffold, but with his birth. Not with his mask, but with his silence. In medieval Europe, the role of executioner was not chosen. It was inherited like a curse, passed from father to son, as though blood itself carried the duty of bloodletting. Families marked by the trade were bound to it for generations, chained to the scaffold as surely as criminals were chained to the block. In some towns, when no one would take the office, a condemned man was offered life in exchange for becoming the hand of death. Survival, but survival through exile. This was no honor, but a brand. To live as an executioner was to walk forever in shadow. Imagine the boy, alone at the edge of a village, his house distant from the marketplace, his mother lowering her voice when neighbors passed. Children avoided him, or else mocked him, calling him cursed. The games of youth, tag, wrestling, laughter in the fields, excluded him. He learned early that to be born into an executioner's line was to be set apart, an island among men. Even his clothes might mark him simple, rough-spun, reminding all that he came from a line that lived on the wages of blood. What do years of such rejection do to the mind of a child? What bitterness, what hunger, what defiance begins to coil within? History shows us that executioners were paradoxes of their communities. They were invited to weddings only to perform ritual humiliations, mocked even as they were fed. They were asked to touch the sick because their hands, soaked in blood, were believed to hold strange healing powers. They were paid with the belongings of the dead, inheriting not just clothes and shoes, but sometimes the very tools of crime: knives, axes, purses. Their lives were stitched from contradictions, feared yet needed, reviled yet sought out, outcast given power, power wrapped in shame. And so the legend begins to make sense. For if one child, born of such lineage, turned inward toward shadow, if he found no solace in society's warmth, but only in its cruelty, would it not be natural for him to embrace that cruelty and make it his own? The boy who was never allowed to forget the faces turned away from him might one day claim faces of his own, stitching them into a mask that the world could not ignore. For what is a mask but a shield, a wall, a way of saying, if you will not look at me when I am alive, you will never be able to look away from me when I am death. But beyond the boy was the world itself, a world that demanded death as ritual. Justice in those centuries was not quiet. It was public, loud, spectacular. It was designed to teach. Every hanging, every burning, every beheading was a performance. Townspeople gathered as though for a festival, buying food, bringing children, gossiping while waiting for the condemned to appear. The scaffold was both courtroom and stage, where punishment became theater and the executioner became actor, priest, and butcher all at once. In such a world, how easily could myth grow? How easily could one man, shunned since birth, step into that role and transform his shame into something unforgettable? Consider the silence after an execution. The crowd disperses, the condemned gone, the priest satisfied, the lords assured of their power. But the executioner remains. He walks home alone, his boots leaving marks in the mud. He washes blood from his hands, his axe, his garments. And as night falls, what dreams plague him? Does he hear the last cries, see the faces of those he struck down? Or does he learn to silence such visions by making them part of himself, by wearing them, by becoming them? Perhaps the mask was never only for the crowd. Perhaps it was for him a way of containing the endless procession of faces that otherwise would have haunted his sleep. Philosophy teaches that identity is forged in recognition. We are who we are because others see us, acknowledge us, mirror us. But what of the man who was denied that recognition, who lived outside the circle of community? Perhaps he created a mask not only to terrify, but to claim identity. The faces of others became his face. Their features became his mirror. Their deaths gave him shape. He became someone because they became no one. It is a grotesque symmetry, but one that echoes across history. Those denied their place often forge it through horror. The chronicles speak of years of plague, years of famine, years when death stalked every street. It was in such years, some say, that the masked executioner first appeared. His origins lost in fire and burial pits, his name erased, but his legend sharpened by hunger and despair. For in times of suffering, people look for scapegoats, for figures to embody their fear. And if the executioner's son had become executioner himself, marked by isolation, wrapped in ritual, carrying blades in service of power, how easy it was for villagers to imagine he had gone further, darker, deeper. The mask was less invention than inevitability, the physical embodiment of what society already believed about him, that he was less man than monster. And still the question lingers, was he real? Was there truly an executioner who stitched masks of flesh and wore them beneath the torchlight? Or was he the invention of villagers who needed a monster to explain their dread? What is history, after all, but memory's mask, stitched from fragments, worn to give shape to truths we cannot bear naked? What we know is this: executioners were men apart, and from that apartness was born the perfect soil for legend. A soil of silence, fear, necessity, and cruelty. And into that soil, a seed of horror was planted. A boy, raised on exile, who grew into a man whose mask was not cloth but skin. A man who turned shame into spectacle. A man who turned ostracism into power. A man who would become a shadow greater than death itself. And so the second act of our tale begins not with his killings, but with his origins. For to understand the mask, we must first understand the boy behind it. And the boy was not merely one child in one town. He was the sum of a society that fed on cruelty while pretending to abhor it, that needed monsters to cleanse itself of guilt. In that contradiction, the legend took root, and once rooted, it would never die. The scaffold was more than wood and rope. It was a stage upon which death itself rehearsed endlessly, each performance a grim reminder that the law was not merely written in parchment, but etched into flesh. In medieval Europe, executions were not hidden behind stone walls or quiet corridors. They were paraded before the people, for punishment was not only retribution. It was spectacle, lesson, theater. And in this theater, the executioner was both actor and instrument, feared not only for his blade, but for the way he transformed justice into performance. Each step he took was choreographed by centuries of ritual, each strike of his axe or tightening of the noose a line in a grim script that all knew by heart. Imagine the scene. Dawn breaks, and the villagers gather. Peddlers hawk roasted nuts and ale as though it were a festival. Children sit upon their fathers' shoulders to glimpse the condemned, and women cross themselves as priests chant final rites. The scaffold looms like an altar, elevated so that no eye can miss the ceremony. Death was to be seen, for what is unseen cannot terrify. The condemned is brought forth, trembling, shuffling, sometimes defiant, sometimes broken. And there, at the center, waits the executioner, the dark figure whose presence alone causes silence to fall like a curtain. He is at once servant and master of the ritual. Without him, there is no justice. Without him, there is no show. The air is charged with paradox. The villagers dread the moment the axe will fall, yet they cannot look away. They are sickened by the thought of blood, yet they lean forward for the best view. Some pray loudly, as though drowning their fear in chants. Others whisper jokes, laughter rising from the same throats that will scream when the blade bites. The scaffold was humanity's mirror, reflecting both its hunger for order and its thirst for cruelty. And at the center of that mirror stood the executioner, his hood or mask rendering him less a man than a symbol, a creature of both law and nightmare. Philosophers have long asked why societies punish publicly. Was it justice? Was it deterrence? Or was it ritualized vengeance disguised as morality? In the medieval square, these questions did not live in books. They lived in the eyes of the crowd. The condemned, kneeling, represented everything society feared: rebellion, heresy, sin. And the moment his head rolled, the people believed themselves cleansed. But cleansing, like hunger, never lasts. Soon another would be led to the block, and the performance would begin anew. The scaffold was the heartbeat of justice, pumping terror through the veins of the city, but was also fragile theater. If the executioner missed his stroke, if the rope snapped, if the fire refused to burn, the ritual faltered. Then fear turned to laughter and authority to mockery. The executioner's role was not only to kill, but to kill with precision, with a cold artistry that reassured the crowd that the world remained in order. One clean stroke, and justice stood tall. One clumsy blow, and chaos cracked the mask of authority. It is no wonder, then, that executioners sometimes cultivated their image as much as their skill. They carried themselves with grim ceremony, their garments distinctive, their presence rehearsed. Some legends claim they even whispered to their victims before striking, as though to draw out one final confession before silencing it forever. And here the legend of the masked executioner takes its root. For if all eyes were on him, if the entire performance depended on his ability to embody dread, would it not follow that he might choose to intensify that dread beyond the expectations of crown or church? The hood was anonymity, but the mask of faces was spectacle magnified, terror refined into an art. Imagine the gasp of the crowd when the condemned looked up and saw, staring back at him, not the faceless black cloth of tradition, but the hollow sockets of another's stolen visage. Imagine the collective shudder as recognition rippled through the onlookers. This was not just death. This was death devouring itself. The execution ground was not limited to one form. In cities, it was a marketplace. In castles, the courtyard. In villages, a hillside where all could watch. Everywhere it became a theater of hierarchy. Nobles in their balconies, priests at the steps, peasants pressed against the barriers, all united in the drama of life and death. For a moment, every class was equal, every person reminded of mortality, every soul bound by the sight of the condemned. The performance of execution was society's most powerful unifier, yet also its most terrible addiction. The executioner was thus a paradoxical actor, nameless, faceless, yet unforgettable. And if he dared to amplify that paradox, if he adorned himself not with cloth but with the flesh of others, he became not only an actor, but the very drama itself. The mask of faces turned the scaffold from theater into nightmare. The lesson of justice became drowned in the spectacle of horror. The villagers may have recoiled, but they would never forget. And legends, after all, are not born from what is easily forgotten. Consider how memory works. We do not remember every sunrise, every meal, every word spoken. We remember shocks, ruptures, images that sear themselves into the brain. The mask was precisely such an image. Even if it appeared once, only once, that would have been enough. Enough to echo for centuries, carried in whispers, embroidered in tavern tales, written cautiously into the margins of parish records. For horror does not need repetition. It needs only to exist once, and memory will do the rest. The theater of death was thus both real and symbolic. Real in the sense of bodies falling, blood spilling, lives ending. Symbolic in the sense that each act was meant to communicate. Obey the law, fear the crown, remember the church. But when the executioner transformed his own role into legend, when he blurred the line between ritual and monstrosity, he reshaped the theater itself. The scaffold ceased to be merely a stage for justice. It became a stage for myth. And so the mask enters history not as artifact, but as performance. Was it truly made of human skin? Or was it merely described that way? Exaggerated by fearful eyes, magnified in the telling? The answer may never be known. But what matters is that in the theater of death, it was believed. The villagers saw it, or thought they saw it, and belief is often stronger than proof. A man who wears the faces of the condemned is not just an executioner. He is a symbol of all that humanity fears about itself. Thus, segment 3 closes not with certainty, but with deepening shadows. The execution ground has revealed itself as both stage and sermon, a place where the executioner stood between order and chaos, between law and terror. And in the whispers of a mask stitched from faces, we glimpse how the performance of death became inseparable from the performance of legend. Every legend has a beginning, a moment where the story crosses the invisible line between what is ordinary and what becomes unforgettable. For the masked executioner, that moment was said to be the night of his first skin. Until then, he had been a man of blood, yes, but still within the confines of ritual. He swung his blade. He tightened his noose. He carried out the will of crown and church as so many before him had done. But one day, or one night, the line blurred. And when it blurred, the mask was born. A simple act of execution transformed into something darker, something ritualistic, something that would outlive every name and every face but his own. The story differs depending on which village's tongue you hear it from. In one telling, it was a murderer condemned for butchering his neighbors in a drunken rage. In another, it was a heretic who defied both priest and scripture, mocking the church until the very end. Some whispers say it was a nobleman, a warlord, whose arrogance led him to the block. Whoever it was, the legend insists that when the body fell, the executioner did not turn away. He lingered. His hand reached not only for the axe, but for the knife. And in the silence after the crowd dispersed, while the moon looked down upon an empty square, he performed his second execution, not of body, but of identity. There is something almost ritualistic in the way the legend is described. Torches burning low, the crowd dispersing, the scaffold creaking in the wind. The executioner kneels by the fallen body, knife in hand. He does not move quickly, but with a calmness that unsettles even the shadows. He cuts not for utility, but for possession. He peels away not cloth, but face, a final theft of identity. And when he rises, he holds in his hand not only the features of the condemned, but something stranger, a new self. The mask that would forever haunt imagination. Why would he do this? Was it madness? Was it ritual? Was it an act of power or an act of desperation? Psychology offers us one possibility. The executioner, despised, exiled from community, denied recognition as a man, may have sought a way to claim identity from others. In taking their faces, he created his own, and wearing their features, he became more than anonymous. He became legion, a single man who carried many. But philosophy suggests another answer. To take a face was to steal not only identity, but soul. In the medieval imagination, the face was the vessel of presence, the proof of selfhood. To remove, it was to erase, to damn, to claim dominion over what even God had granted. Consider how masks have always haunted humanity. From the painted visages of tribal shamans to the gilded masks of kings entombed in splendor, from the theatrical masks of Greece to the ceremonial masks of Africa and Asia, every culture has known the strange alchemy of covering the human face with another. Masks conceal, but they also transform. A man in a mask is no longer himself. He becomes other. He becomes more. He becomes myth. The executioner, in donning his first mask of flesh, crossed into this same territory, but not with clay or wood or gold. With the most sacred substance of all, skin. The legend is cruel in its detail. It speaks of stitches, of rough thread biting into soft flesh, of hollowed sockets that seem to stare though no spirit remained behind them. It tells of lips sewn shut, grins forced into shapes never meant for life. And yet, these details, whether true or exaggerated, made the story unforgettable. The first mask was not just a grotesque act of mutilation. It was a declaration, a promise that the executioner had stepped beyond duty into something that no priest or king had ordered, something born of his own will. He had claimed the condemned in a way that was neither lawful nor holy, but personal. He had taken death into his own image. From that moment forward, every execution in which he appeared was different. Some swore the condemned trembled not from the blade, but from a mask, that their final prayers faltered when they saw before them not a hooded man, but a reflection of death itself, stitched and lifeless, yet worn as though it breathed. Others said that when he lifted the mask to his face, the air grew still, as though even the wind recoiled. And there were those who whispered that when he wore it, his voice changed, deepened, echoing as if many voices spoke through him. Such are the embellishments of legend. But even embellishments tell us what mattered. It was not the killing alone that terrified. It was the mask, the first skin, the first transformation. We must ask, was this a single moment, or a story woven from centuries of fear? Was there truly a night when an executioner claimed his first mask? Or was the tale a metaphor, a way for villagers to give flesh to the nameless dread that hung over every scaffold? Perhaps the mask was never literal, but symbolic of the way executioners absorbed the identities of those they killed. For in truth, each condemned left something upon him: their last cry, their final gaze, their silence. The mask may simply have been a way of saying, he wore them all. Yet the legend insists otherwise. It insists upon that night, upon that act, upon the first skin. And in its insistence, it teaches us something about fear. Fear thrives not in abstraction, but in image. To say that the executioner was cruel is one thing. To say that he stitched faces into masks is another. The latter lives, breathes, and lingers in memory. It horrifies across centuries. And so the first mask, whether fact or invention, survives because it could not be forgotten. And here begins the widening of the shadow. For once a mask exists, it multiplies. One face leads to another, one skin becomes two, then three. Soon the executioner is no longer a man, but a collection, a mosaic of the condemned. He is legion in truth as well as imagination. Each mask becomes a chapter, each stitch a sentence, each hollow socket an unblinking witness. And the boy once despised, once mocked, now strides into legend with the faces of others covering his own. The first skin was not just an act. It was an initiation. Legends are not written first in ink, but in breath. They live in the spaces between words, in the murmur of voices carried over firelight, in the hush that falls when a story grows too dark for comfort. The tale of the masked executioner spread not through royal decrees or parish records, but through alehouses, taverns, and gatherings where fear mingled freely with wine. If the scaffold was his stage, then the tavern was his echo, a place where what had been seen by a few was multiplied into visions seen by many. And with each telling, the story grew darker, sharper, more unforgettable. Picture it: a tavern thick with smoke, the smell of spilled ale souring the rushes beneath wooden benches, the crack of dice against a table, the sudden lull as one man leans forward and lowers his voice. He speaks of the execution he saw that morning. The blade fell true, but it was not the strike he cannot forget. It was the mask. Hollow eyes, stitched lips, a face not belonging to the living, but carried by the hand of the executioner as though it were crown or relic. The listeners lean closer. Some laugh nervously. Others cross themselves. And in that moment, the executioner walks again, reborn in memory, alive in fear. Stories like this spread as quickly as plague. A traveler hears it in one village and carries it to the next. A soldier stationed far from home repeats it around his fire. A monk, who has no business repeating tavern tales, nevertheless scribbles a note in the margins of his parchment. There are those who say fear makes its own pathways, and the masked executioner became a figure too potent to remain confined to one square of one city. He became a wanderer, moving in rumor from region to region, until even places where no such executioner ever lived came to believe that he had walked among them. And in each place, the legend changed. In the lowlands, he was a phantom who stole the faces of sinners to wear them as warnings. In the mountains, He was a cursed wanderer doomed to carry the skin of every soul he sent into the afterlife. In cities, he became a warning whispered to criminals: confess quickly, or he will make you his mask. The tale was reshaped by the needs of those who told it, yet always retained its essence: the horror of a man who did not merely kill, but consumed identity itself. Taverns made him immortal because taverns were the stage of memory. In them, stories grew bold and grotesque, fueled by ale and the hunger to astonish. A man who had seen a plain execution might embellish, claiming the mask glared, that the condemned screamed not at death but at recognition. Another, hearing the tale secondhand, would add more. Perhaps the mask smiled, perhaps it whispered, perhaps the executioner lifted it to drink from his mug. Soon the executioner was no longer a figure of one event, but a legend that multiplied with every voice that carried him. And yet, what is fascinating is not merely the exaggeration, but the need. Why did these men, hardened by toil and hunger, feel compelled to retell this story? Why not let it vanish into silence? The answer lies in the nature of myth. Myths are not idle entertainment. They are instruments. They warn, they explain, they unify. To tell of the masked executioner was to remind listeners of the dangers of law, the cruelty of power, the inescapability of death. It was also, paradoxically, to enjoy fear safely, to sit in a warm tavern and flirt with horror that could not reach through the door. The executioner became not only a figure of dread, but a kind of ghostly companion, a presence shared in laughter as much as in shivers. Some scholars suggest that the legend was shaped deliberately, cultivated by rulers or priests. What better way to ensure obedience than to spread tales of servant of justice who carried not only blades, but the faces of the damned, to frighten children into obedience, to silence whispers of rebellion, to paint justice not as mercy, but as inevitability. The executioner in taverns became larger than the executioner on scaffolds, for his legend traveled farther than his body ever could. He became, in effect, a second execution, a killing of hope performed not with steel, but with story. But there is another angle. The alehouse, after all, was not only a place of fear, it was a place of rebellion. It was in taverns that peasants mocked kings, that rumors of uprisings were born, that laughter at priests was safe behind closed doors. And so the masked executioner's legend may have carried not only dread, but defiance. To whisper of him was to whisper of the cruelty of justice, of the monstrousness of power. To exaggerate his horror was to expose its absurdity. For if justice required a man who wore human faces, then justice itself was a monster. Think of the faces lit by firelight, the mugs lifted, the dice forgotten as one more detail is added to the tale. Some believe he vanished into the woods, his mask glowing in the moonlight. Others claim he walked into battle, axes in hand, his many faces glaring at soldiers who fled before steel touched them. And still others swore that he was not a man at all, but death itself, borrowing faces as a shepherd borrows cloaks. With every retelling, he shed his humanity further, becoming less executioner and more myth. Thus, alehouses became temples of memory, and drunken voices became chroniclers more enduring than parchment. The masked executioner became a legend, not because he lived, but because he was told, retold, reshaped, and carried by thousands of lips across centuries. He became an echo so loud that even now, it has not faded. Power is never satisfied with the swing of a blade alone. To endure, it must weave itself into ritual, cloak itself in sacred words, and shape itself into images that reach further than swords or scaffolds. The legend of the masked executioner, whether born from truth or terror, was too powerful to remain confined to tavern whispers. It drifted upwards into courts and cathedrals, into the sermons of priests and the secret fears of kings. Between crown and cross, he became something more than a man. He became a tool of authority, sharpened by the needs of both throne and altar, His mask, not merely a grotesque image, but a political instrument. In those centuries, the throne was fragile. Kings feared their own nobles. Nobles feared their own peasants, and every hand trembled beneath the gaze of the church. Power was brittle, held together by ritual, spectacle, and fear. Justice was one tool, but justice alone was not enough. Fear was the mortar that bound crowns to heads and kept scepters from falling. The scaffold, therefore, was more than punishment. It was reinforcement, a public rehearsal of authority. And the masked executioner, whispered through villages and cities alike, became the embodiment of that rehearsal. He was no longer simply the man who struck the final blow. He was the specter that proved defiance would be remembered in flesh and sewn into horror. Priests began to allude to him in their homilies. They never named him outright, but their words carried the echo of his legend. Beware sin, for it wears the faces of the damned. Some claimed he was an agent of God's wrath, each stitch a judgment, each mask a sign that the soul behind it had forfeited eternity. To disobey the crown was to risk losing not only life, but identity itself. A terrifying thought that one's features, one's very likeness, might become part of a mask that stared forever at the living. Fear of hellfire was powerful. Fear of obliteration was even greater. And so his shadow slipped into sermons, twisting faith into dread. Kings, too, made use of the story. They did not need to prove that such a man existed. They needed only to let the whisper remain. For in politics, rumor is more powerful than truth. A king could stand before his court and declare, "My justice wears the faces of traitors," and suddenly rebellion was less appealing. The mask became a symbol of the crown's reach. It was the idea that disobedience would not end in silence, but in spectacle. That punishment was not simply about the body. It was about memory, about stripping away the very face that defined a person. To wear another's face was to claim their history, their identity, their dignity. And that act, whether literal or imagined, was enough to keep rebellion at bay. The mask thus became a political emblem, one that neither church nor crown denied. Chroniclers painted grotesques in the margins of Scripture. Faces stitched together, eyes hollow, grins unnatural. Illuminated manuscripts meant to honor kings sometimes contained strange, disturbing images, as though even within holy text the executioner's shadow could not be banished. Power thrives on contradiction, and here it thrived on terror disguised as order. For rulers, the mask was deterrence. For priests, it was punishment. And for both, it was a story that bound subjects in obedience without a single blade being raised. But what did it mean for the people? To them, the masked executioner was not an agent of mercy, but a reminder that both throne and altar could consume rather than protect. He stood as proof that justice was never clean, that sanctity itself could be soaked in cruelty. And perhaps this is why the story endured. Because in the figure of the masked executioner, the people saw the truth that neither crown nor cross wished to admit, that all power hides its face, and that sometimes the face it hides behind is one it has stolen from those it destroys. And so between crown and cross, the executioner became not merely legend, but instrument. He belonged to no one, yet served everyone's purpose. To kings he was a weapon, to priests he was a sermon, to peasants he was a warning, and to memory he was eternal. He walked in shadows, not because he chose them, but because all power needs shadows to survive. And in his mask, stitched or imagined, the people saw both the cruelty of rulers and the reflection of their own silent fear. The condemned were never nameless. Though history reduces them to footnotes, though parchment records only their crimes and punishments, each one carried a life, a voice, a face. And in the legend of the masked executioner, those faces did not vanish into silence. They were taken, stitched, absorbed into his shadow. To speak of him is to speak of them, for his mask was nothing without their features. Each condemned man or woman became a part of his identity. And in that grotesque union, their stories lived on in ways neither crown nor church could erase. The first tale told is of a thief, not a great bandit, not a lord of the forests, but a poor man who stole bread from a monastery storehouse. Hunger is its own crime, and famine makes desperate men. He was caught, beaten, paraded before the people as an example. Some pitied him, others spat at him, yet all watched as the scaffold claimed him. The story says the executioner bent low over his body, and when he rose again, he carried the thief's face in his hand. From that day, villagers swore the mask bore hollow cheeks and eyes sunken with hunger. The condemned thief lived on, his crime carved forever into the mask that would haunt others. Was this justice or cruelty magnified into ritual? And what lesson did it teach? That hunger itself was punishable by eternal disfigurement. Another story speaks of a woman accused of witchcraft. She was said to whisper charms in fields, to heal the sick with herbs, to speak too boldly when men wished her silent. Her trial was no trial at all. It was accusation repeated until it became truth. She was dragged to the scaffold, her body bruised, her voice hoarse from protest. And there, the legend says, the executioner claimed her face. The mask that followed bore lips pressed shut, a symbol of silenced speech, of women muted by fear. In taverns, the story spread with a cruel twist. Men warned daughters and wives that disobedience would earn them a place upon a mask. But in secret, women whispered something different, that perhaps in wearing her face, the executioner had unwillingly preserved her defiance. That each stitch was not just a silencing, but a reminder that she had once spoken. Then there was the heretic, a preacher who defied the bishops, who claimed that God dwelled not only in cathedrals, but in the fields and forests, in the voices of peasants as much as kings. For such audacity, he was condemned. His tongue was cut, his body broken, and finally he was delivered to the executioner. The legend says his mask bore eyes forever open, staring upward, refusing to close. The villagers who told the tale believed those eyes haunted even the executioner himself, that they accused him each time he lifted the mask. The heretic's voice was gone, but his gaze endured, stitched into leather, immortal in silence. Perhaps that is why his story survived in hushed tones among peasants who longed for freedom, that the executioner himself could not erase conviction, even when the church demanded it. Some stories grew darker still. A noble general, victorious in battle but treacherous in court, was said to have been betrayed, condemned, and executed. His face, proud even in death, was claimed for the mask. Soldiers whispered that when the executioner wore it, he walked as though bearing the arrogance of kings. His stitched visage was a warning to all nobles. Defiance of the throne would not merely kill you, it would make you spectacle. The power you once carried would be paraded forever, reduced to a grotesque ornament upon another man's flesh. Here the mask became political theater, a collection of reminders that no station, no title, could protect you from judgment. Others were simpler, smaller tales, faces of highwaymen, of deserters, of beggars accused of blasphemy. Each one, when whispered in taverns, became more than themselves. They became lessons. The highwayman's face was said to sneer eternally from the mask, daring all who saw it to remember his crimes. The deserter's face, sewn pale and hollow, reminded soldiers of the price of cowardice. The beggar's face, gaunt and cracked, taught that even poverty could be punished by eternal humiliation. Each condemned became a character in a greater morality play, their individuality erased, yet paradoxically preserved through the mass collection. Philosophically, this raises a question both haunting and profound. When identity is stolen, does it die, or does it live on in distorted form? The condemned, erased by scaffold and decree, lived again through the executioner's mask. They were reduced to fragments, yet those fragments made them immortal. The mask was both tomb and monument, both annihilation and preservation. And in this paradox lay its horror. For what does it mean to exist only as a warning, to survive only as terror in the eyes of others. The mask was never one face, it was many. A thief, a woman silenced, a heretic, a noble, a beggar, a soldier. Each one stitched not just with thread, but with memory. The executioner did not merely kill. He collected, he curated, he wore them so that none could forget, so that fear would ripple across generations. And the people who saw their neighbors, their kin, their reflections upon that mask, understood the cruel truth. Justice devours everyone, and even innocence can be stitched into warning. And so, Segment 7 closes not upon the executioner alone, but upon those whose lives became part of him. For to speak of his mask is to speak of every condemned soul, every cry silenced, every face denied burial. His legend was not forged by his hands alone, but by the multitude of faces he carried. And in remembering him, we are forced to remember them, the condemned who, in death, became eternal. Every legend eventually meets resistance. For fear, though potent, invites defiance as surely as it commands obedience. The story of the masked executioner was no different. It grew so large, so heavy with dread, that one village, perhaps out of courage, perhaps out of desperation, chose not to tremble but to stand. Their story is told in fragments, in parish notes and peasant tales, but always with the same refrain. There was a place where people rose against him, and for a moment, the mask itself seemed mortal. The village was small, ringed by fields of barley, and guarded only by a wooden palisade. It had endured famine, plague, and tax collectors, yet nothing filled it with such unease as the whisper that the masked one was coming. Mothers hushed their children, blacksmiths sharpened their tools into makeshift weapons, priests sprinkled holy water upon the gates. For once, fear did not drive silence. It drove preparation. They believed that if they faced him together, they might banish the shadow that haunted their sleep. Stories say they gathered in the square, torches burning, eyes fixed upon the road that wound into the valley. They sang hymns to steady their breath, though the verses wavered with doubt. The priest raised a crucifix high, declaring that no demon could cross its light. Old women muttered charms from elder days, charms that the church condemned but did not forbid in that hour of need. Even children clutched stones, ready to hurl them if the shadow appeared. It was not courage alone that filled them, but exhaustion. Fear lived too long, curdles into resistance. And then, in the telling, he came. Some say he emerged from the woods, his mask glimmering in moonlight, stitched lips pulled into a grimace that seemed to move though no words were spoken. Others say he walked the road calmly, each step measured, as though he had known all along they would wait. The villagers trembled, but they did not scatter. They stood their ground, and when he entered the square, the air broke with cries, with prayers, with the clang of iron against wood. For the first time, the legend met defiance not in whispers, but in open battle. What happened next is told in conflicting voices. One tale says the blacksmith struck him with a hammer, and though his mask cracked, beneath it was only shadow, scattering like smoke. Another says the priest cast holy water upon him, and the stitches burned, his mask melting into the soil. Yet another swears that arrows pierced him, and when he fell, the villagers rushed forward only to find no body at all, only the mask, lying empty upon the stones. Each telling ends differently, but all share one truth. The village believed, for a moment, that they had broken the terror that haunted them. And yet, the aftermath tells another story. For though the village stood, though the mask was said to be destroyed, the legend did not end. Travelers carried whispers of their defiance, but with it came new variations. Some said the executioner had only been wounded, and that his mask was reforged with new faces. Others claimed that by resisting him, the villagers had cursed themselves, that their descendants would forever dream of stitched faces and hollow eyes. Still others insisted that he never came at all, that the entire event was invented by villagers eager to boast of courage they had never shown. Such is the nature of myth. It grows stronger not in certainty, but in contradiction. Philosophically, this tale of defiance reveals something about fear itself. Fear can rule, but it can also unite. A village that had endured hunger, plague, and tyranny found its strength not in wealth or armies, but in shared terror. They chose not to scatter, but to stand. And in doing so, they created a story as enduring as the legend they fought. Whether or not the executioner was real mattered less than the fact that they believed their defiance had power. And that belief reshaped the legend, adding to it a new dimension, that even shadows could be resisted. But the mask endures precisely because the story never resolves. Was he destroyed? Was he banished? Did he rise again elsewhere, stronger for having been defied? The villagers themselves could not agree, and their descendants told the tale with pride and dread in equal measure. Some boasted of ancestors who struck him down. Others shuddered, claiming the price of defiance was endless haunting. And so the mask lived on, stitched not only from flesh, but from contradiction. For in legend, defeat is never final. It is simply another mask, another face added to the collection. And so segment 8 closes with ambiguity. The village that defied him reminds us that even fear can be challenged, that terror can be met with torchlight and prayer. But it also reminds us that legends do not die in squares or fields. They die only when forgotten. And the masked executioner has never been forgotten. Whether broken, banished, or triumphant, he walks still, in memory, in story, in the uneasy silence that follows whenever we ask, what would we do if the mask turned toward us? Centuries passed, and yet the shadow of the masked executioner did not fade. The scaffold rotted into the earth. The villages rebuilt their homes. Kings fell. Bishops were replaced, but the mask remained, if not in flesh, then in memory. It lingered like a stain that could not be erased, whispered in the same way storms are spoken of long after they pass. The man may have died, his bones buried or scattered, his name erased from records, but the legend endured. And as time stretched further away from his life, it did not weaken. It grew. For the more distant he became, the less bound he was to fact. He lived now in fragments, in contradictions, in echoes, and men and women of later centuries could not resist the temptation to chase those echoes. Some sought him in parchment. Scholars bent over the brittle pages of parish ledgers, searching for names of executioners long forgotten. They found records of men employed by towns, sometimes paid in coins, sometimes in food, sometimes even rewarded with the clothes of the condemned. But the name of the masked one never appeared clearly. At best, there were hints, a priest's marginal note about a man who bore the faces of the damned, or a villager's confession written down by a scribe that spoke of eyes staring even after death. These fragments tantalized, yet they proved nothing. Still, they were enough to keep the scholars arguing. Was he real, hidden behind anonymity, his truth deliberately erased? Or was he only the product of fear, a fiction stitched together by centuries of whispers? The debates themselves ensured his survival. For every time his existence was questioned, his presence deepened. Others searched not in books, but in soil. Grave robbers wandered cemeteries, peeling back earth to uncover skulls scarred by axe blows, ribs fractured by rope, bones burned black by fire. They claimed such remains were proof of the condemned whose faces had been taken. And sometimes they displayed relics, patches of leather, shriveled and dark, said to be fragments of the executioner's mask. Were they real? Perhaps. Or perhaps they were nothing but forgeries, sewn from animal hide and sold to the gullible. Yet the effect was the same. A relic, whether genuine or false, commands belief if enough eyes stare upon it. And so the relics, authentic or invented, kept the legend alive. In the age of cabinets of curiosity, collectors claimed to possess pieces of the mask. Among mummified hands, preserved snakes, and shards of bone labeled as saints, they displayed stitched leather with hollow sockets, lips sealed by thread. Visitors recoiled, crossed themselves, whispered prayers, but they never forgot what they saw. Even if the mask was a fraud, it became truth through spectacle. The executioner's shadow lived not in the man himself, but in the hunger of those who wished to see him. The mask became theater once again, this time not on the scaffold, but behind glass. Storytellers, too, carried his image. Ballads were sung of the faceless man who walked at night. Traveling actors put on plays where the executioner appeared, cloaked in robes, wearing masks painted grotesquely to resemble skin. Pamphlets printed in cheap ink spread tales of villages haunted by him, of soldiers who fled at the sight of his visage. The more he was performed, the less it mattered whether he had ever existed. For performance is its own truth, and once an image is carved into imagination, it does not need a body to walk. Philosophy enters here. Why do such figures endure? Why does memory cling to horror longer than it does to joy? Perhaps it is because horror demands retelling. A feast is enjoyed and forgotten, but a nightmare is carried forward, its details sharpened with every recounting. The executioner became nightmare embodied, and so he was repeated, embroidered, magnified. His mask was not just a face of flesh. It was a vessel of memory itself. To see it in imagination was to recognize the terror of losing one's own identity, of becoming nothing but an ornament of fear. Even in modern times, whispers persisted. Historians argued that he might have been based on a German executioner, or a French one, or a Polish one. Anthropologists compared his legend to the ritual masks of shamans, suggesting that he was Europe's own distorted echo of a universal archetype, the man who wears another's skin to gain power. Psychologists saw in him the embodiment of humanity's oldest dread, that the self could be erased, stolen, and replaced. Each discipline gave him life again, recasting him not as man, but as metaphor. He walked no longer in villages, but in lecture halls, in books, in the unspoken shiver that passes through listeners when his story is told aloud. Thus, centuries after his supposed death, the mask survives and echoes. Not of flesh, but of fascination. Not of blood, but of memory. Whether he was real or not has become almost irrelevant. What matters is that he is still spoken of, still sought, still feared. For history is not only what happened. History is also what we remember, what we choose to tell, what we cannot forget. And the masked executioner, through fragments and fabrications, through relics and retellings, remains unforgettable. And so segment 9 ends with the echo of flesh, not flesh itself, but the memory of it, reverberating through centuries. A mask perhaps long gone, or perhaps still hidden, waiting in some locked chest or forgotten crypt. Real or imagined, it does not matter. For in imagination, he still lives. And imagination, unlike flesh, does not decay. Every story must end, yet some refuse to die. The tale of the masked executioner belongs to that strange category of legend that seems endless, as though the telling itself is part of its survival. His body is gone, his scaffold long since collapsed, but his mask, whether stitched in reality or imagined in memory, still lingers. To conclude his story is to confront not only what he was, but what we are. For every legend is a mirror, and this legend, more than most, reflects the shadows of humanity itself. The executioner's mask asks us questions that are as old as death. What is identity? What does it mean to wear a face? Can the self be stolen, erased, consumed by another? Medieval villagers trembled at these questions without speaking them, for in seeing the mask they saw their own mortality, their own vulnerability. Modern listeners tremble too, though in different language. We fear being forgotten, reduced, our uniqueness lost in a world that swallows individuals into anonymity. The executioner embodied this terror centuries ago, and in his legend we recognize the same dread today. He was not only a figure of death, he was a figure of erasure. His legend threads through every layer of society. For peasants, he was a cautionary tale whispered by firelight, proof that justice was monstrous and impartial. For nobles, He was a reminder that power did not make one untouchable, that a crown could end not in reverence, but in stitches. For priests, he was sermon and symbol, a grotesque reminder that sin could be punished by obliteration of self. For kings, he was a tool of propaganda, a weapon wielded not in flesh, but in imagination. And for us, centuries later, he is an archetype, a metaphor of how fear shapes memory more enduringly than truth. In the arc of his story, we have seen a boy born into exile, denied community, turned into a shadow by necessity. We have seen a man on the scaffold, transformed from servant of justice into performer of horror. We have seen the first mask, the first face taken, the first step across the line from ritual into legend. We have seen taverns echo with his name, kings and priests exploit his image, villagers dare to resist him, and scholars centuries later scour the earth for his remnants. Each stage of the tale adds another layer to the mask, another stitch in the fabric of myth. And now, as we close, we see that what he truly wore was not flesh, but the collective fear of humanity itself. What is a mask, after all? It is concealment, but it is also revelation. It hides the face beneath, yet shows the shape of something else. A carnival mask hides a man, but reveals his mischief. A death mask hides breath, but preserves memory. The executioner's mask concealed his anonymity, but revealed society's dread. When villagers saw it, they were not seeing him, they were seeing themselves. Their crimes, their sins, their mortality, stitched and hollow-eyed, reflected back at them. The mask was not an artifact of cruelty alone. It was a mirror, and perhaps this is why his legend survives. Humanity has always needed its monsters. We create them when we cannot face our own truths. We summon them in stories so that we can point to them and say, that is what we fear, that is what we reject, that is what we must avoid. But monsters also seduce us because they carry the very traits we deny in ourselves. The masked executioner was despised, yet admired. Hated, yet necessary. A figure both reviled and relied upon. In him lies the paradox of every society. We condemn cruelty even as we require it. We denounce violence even as we demand it. We shun death even as we perform it. His mask is stitched not only from faces, but from contradictions. Philosophy teaches that memory is a form of survival, and myth is memory made eternal. The executioner, real or not, survived because he became unforgettable. He was carried not in official records, but in tavern songs, in whispered warnings, in grotesque illustrations at the margins of holy books. He was preserved because he gave form to what was otherwise unspoken. The condemned may have died once on the scaffold, but through his mask, they lived again as warnings, as faces without names. In this way, his mask was not just horror, it was continuity. It allowed the dead to remain, even if only as terror. And now we must ask, what do we see when we look into the hollow sockets of that legend? Do we see a man, long gone, who may or may not have existed? Or do we see ourselves, reflected in absence, our own fear of identity lost, our own dread of anonymity, our own awareness that every face we wear in life will one day become a mask of memory to those who survive us? The mask forces us to confront mortality not as an abstraction, but as image. It tells us, you will be forgotten, you will be replaced, and what remains may not be truth, but only legend. The final cruelty is this. The executioner himself is faceless. His name is unknown, his body unrecovered, his truth uncertain. He wore many faces, yet left none of his own. In this, his legend closes the circle. For is that not the fate of all humanity? We wear faces, we play roles. We are remembered for fragments, for distortions, for stories half true. Perhaps the executioner was not unique. Perhaps he was only the most vivid example of a truth that belongs to us all. That in the end, we are masks stitched together by memory, worn by those who speak of us when we are gone. And so his story ends where ours continues. The masked executioner, whether man or myth, invites us to consider the faces we wear, the stories we tell, and the shadows we leave behind. His mask was horror, yes, but it was also revelation. It revealed not only the cruelty of justice, but the nature of memory, the fragility of identity, the hunger of society for spectacle. And as long as those truths remain, so too will he. For legends do not end. They wait in silence, in the breath between words, in the gaze of those who dare to remember.